There is a rarely discussed distinction between factual learning and attitudinal learning. In the title of this video, I'm proposing to you a distinction between military literacy and military illiteracy, right? But what I mean by literacy in this case is understanding what you read. I don't mean that you have memorized a catalog of the munitions of war, right? I don't mean that you're someone who knows what the serial numbers mean on the side of different kinds of munitions and tanks. I'm not talking about being burdened with a whole lot of factual learning, but I am talking about an attitude. I'm talking about an attitude and a sensitivity towards the reality of war that I think has to be cultivated over a lifetime, and that I now see is shockingly absent from both the journalists and the political leaders of our time. These are people who don't know war. These are people who don't understand war, who cannot think in terms of realistic 21st century warfare. And of course, their illiteracy is dangerous for us all. Now, start with an example some of you will relate to and understand right away. There is a much more successful YouTuber, much more successful than myself. There's a very successful YouTuber called Adam something. His formal educational background is in urban planning, something that's political, nothing to do with war. And he lives with the dangerous delusion that being an expert in something means he's an expert in everything. And in two different videos, he picked up the newspaper headline, a claim made by mainstream journalists in mainstream newspapers. Russian attack helicopters are useless. Russian attack helicopters are going to be completely immobilized and useless during this conflict because the Ukrainians have shoulder-mounted missiles, because men on foot will have shoulder-mounted anti-aircraft missiles. Now, I don't expect any of you to recognize the brand name of the hardware. I don't expect any of you to recognize the model number. I don't expect anyone who's engaged in political and democratic discourse about these things or engaged in journalism about these things to be spending time looking through the back pages of the hardware catalog that you order these things from, looking at the technical specifications. What I expect people to be able to do is to reason these things through to their utmost limits, to deal with the ramifications and implications of the assumptions they carry with them into these political debates and the factual assertions they're making. Even someone like Adam somebody, it's probably needless to say, he is somebody I despise. Sorry, Adam something. It's actually the name of his YouTube channel. He's someone I have a great deal of contempt for, but I can recognize that in his way, politically, he is trying to make the world a better place. Another comparison, Hassan Abi, someone I have a lot of contempt for, someone I despise politically. But of course, I can recognize the goodness of his intentions as now increasingly he finds himself wading into the details of how these wars are fought, including specific claims about the efficacy of shoulder-mounted missiles. Now, what do I mean? Reasoning things through. If shoulder-mounted missiles, if they made attack helicopters useless, if they made aerial bombardment from airplanes useless or very limited value in war, that would have already been true in the Syrian civil war just a few years ago. That would have already been true in the American invasion and conquest of Iraq just a few years before that. That would have already been true when the Afghan people, including the Taliban, were fighting against the Soviet Union. These types of propaganda claims, this type of hype for shoulder-mounted missiles, it goes all the way back. right? You can already find it in newspapers reporting on our allies in Afghanistan when they were fighting against the Soviet Union. Now, reason it through. Think about it. Now, the most ridiculous thing is this claim is not only made about aircraft, about the ability of a man on foot with a shoulder-mounted missile to destroy an attack helicopter. What a claim. Just visualize yourself. Just think it through. Just flesh out the fantasy. Imagine if it's your life on the line. Imagine if you are hiding in a foxhole with a shoulder-mounted missile and you've got to get out to take your shot. Just visualize it for a minute. You know, again, sympathy is an analytical tool. I'm not telling you to sympathize with people just so that you're overwhelmed with emotions. But think about the fear and the agony where your life is going to be traded to take a pot shot at an attack helicopter that is armed with exactly the type of anti-personnel weapons that you have no armor to sustain shots from. Again, I'm trying not to get into technical details. Just start to think about how implausible that is, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in ongoing wars in North Africa now, like Libya, or the use of attack helicopters in Northeast Africa and fighting various forms of Muslim extremists who are there. Attack helicopters are devastating all these wars, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Afghanistan. Okay, for some reason now we're fantasizing that these are tremendously effective weapons for unarmored men on foot to use. They're going to hide in a foxhole, pop out, and they're going to destroy an attack helicopter. They're going to destroy a bomber or a fighter jet screeching overhead. There's a lot of things to visualize here. And if you've seen footage of this, when someone fires a gun, or just a rifle, a normal rifle, right? You'll notice you can't really see the bullet exiting the muzzle of the rifle. It's too fast to really be captured on screen. But when they fire these missiles, especially as the missile is first leaving, it's quite slow, isn't it? You can really see it taking off, more like a model rocket, right? Think about that. Think about how much time there is for this attack helicopter, and it won't be alone, right? For this squadron of attack helicopters, so this group of airplanes or attack helicopters, right? Even more astonishingly, these propaganda claims are being made and they're being repeated on social media about men on foot and their ability to disable and conquer tanks, armored personnel carriers, that allegedly these Russian tanks, they're useless, they're helpless now because men on foot can just use a shoulder-mounted missile. An astonishing, ridiculous propaganda claim. And again, if that were true, just reason it through. Think about the last 50 years of warfare. Think about any of the discussions that have been going on about wars in your life. Why would it only be true now? Why is it that suddenly shoulder-mounted missiles used by men on foot? Now, the fundamental point I want to get at here is already hinted at in the description of this video. Before I even had a YouTube channel, I got out and promoted this hashtag Socratic method is dead. Now, partly it's a joke. It is partly something I joke around about, but it's partly something really serious I try to draw attention to. I think in the 21st century, most people do not have anyone with them in their lives where they can challenge each other and really reason things through this way. Like, unfortunately, I feel that the era of Socratic method is dead. It certainly doesn't happen in universities anymore. It certainly doesn't. It's not a reality that universities, professors will take the time to sit with their students and reason these things through. I think what I just said to you, you can maybe imagine, hypothetically, a very kindly university professor, very generous with his or her time, sitting down and talking to a student who is influenced by Hassan Piker, or influenced by, we just have Vaush being mentioned, influenced by mainstream newspapers, but maybe influenced by a YouTuber like Adam something, and said, okay, look, so I know you've read this about these shoulder-mounted missiles. I know you've read all these things about the success of the Ukrainian people in resisting Russian conquest. Okay, but have you thought this through? Okay, but if that were true, if that were true, then this would also be true, right? I know this is not using a really narrow definition of Socratic dialogue. I'm using it in its broadest sense, where you end up challenging each other or challenging yourself to really reason things through fully. The term used in a more academic context, they always say to tease out ambiguities, tease out implicit assumptions. I don't really. This is very British to me, to tease something out. I don't, I guess when you have curly hair, you tease out your hair as you're combing it. Is that what the image comes from? Yeah, Melissa. I'm asking Melissa. Melissa has hair. And does anyone in the audience have hair? Can anyone?
Yes, teasing your hair.
So
yes, you tease your hair to make it have more volume.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Melissa says you tease your hair to make it have more volume, and not to make it straighter. Okay. I'm just pointing out the implicit metaphor of speaking about teasing out.
I do very little to my hair, so I'm sorry if I don't know the proper terminology.
We have 26 people in the audience. None of you have hair? No? Hit the thumbs up if you have a second, guys. It helps more people join the broadcast as it's going and help more people discover it later too. But I'm glad to have you all here. And obviously, it's hard to make time for these things. It's hard for me to make time to do this broadcast. And I understand for you guys it's hard. But I hope this has this kind of function in your lives also. I think it's something tremendously important about really challenging yourself to think these things through all the way and deal with the implications of the political positions you've adopted, to deal with the implications of the solutions to problems that you yourself propose, that you yourself espouse. Because my fundamental concern that I'm expressing through this hashtag Socratic method is dead. My fundamental concern is that we live in an era now where people make bold declarations on Instagram. People make bold declarations on Twitter. And my experience is, even in the university classroom, people stand up and make bold declarations that sound very much like a statement on Twitter or on Instagram. It's Instagram in real life. And then they sit down, and that is it. There's this kind of single stage of a declaration, single stage of analysis, and nobody is really willing to think through and challenge. Okay, but if that were true, if that were a good solution, let's have some more dominoes fall here. Let's really think through the implications. So there are a lot of these examples is kind of in my own life, and where this is the role I play for other people, in as much as I have time to engage in this broadest sense, Socratic dialogue. I had a longtime supporter of the channel talk to me in the last few days. You guys might have seen him in the comment section here. His name is Manan Goenka. So his name has been used publicly here, so feel fine to say it. He was asking me about United Nations policy, basically in alleviating starvation. And the term used in the industry is quote unquote food security. So it is something I've talked about on my YouTube channel years ago. It is something I know about. It's something I've experienced about. Totally different topic. But, right off the bat, a lot of what I'm doing in that conversation is saying to him, and he did appreciate this. He thanked me repeatedly. I said, well, look, most of what you're going to hear from the United Nations, most of what you're going to hear from these charities and partner agencies, it's a very peculiar kind of propaganda. And let's think about it. If what they were saying were true, this, and this would also be true. In fact, my point being here, it may seem tremendously vague to say, oh, you have to think things through to their conclusions. You have to think them through to the utmost limits and consequences of what they mean. But it becomes quite precise as soon as we're dealing with any specific example this way. What would it mean if attack helicopters were made obsolete by shoulder-mounted rockets? That would have all kinds of consequences, and we would have seen those consequences already in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. How can that possibly be true now and only now? And again, reasoning through, what if it were me? What if I were on the battlefield? How would I get close enough to a column of tanks to use this? And then how would I get away with my life afterwards? If I managed to pop out of a foxhole where I've been concealed by camouflage and where no one discovered me, it's very likely you're going to be discovered. I pop and I got one shot with one shoulder-mounted missile before the tank I'm targeting shoots me or the three other tanks in the column shoot me. How effective is that really? How effective can that be? And if it were true that shoulder-mounted missiles are so effective against tanks, why aren't they all just men on foot? Wouldn't it be way more effective to just have 1,000 men marching on foot? without armored personnel carriers. Why do you think we do that? Like, there are all these knock-on consequences to the hypothesis, to the way the problem is being formulated, and to the solution. Now, I know this comparison to starvation and food insecurity, it may seem like a stretch. Well, okay, one is war, and one is dealing with very technical hardware in war. Okay, so that's one type of conversation. And then there are humanitarian claims made about people needing food. Like, isn't that straightforward? No. They are very similar, because in both cases, what you're trying to justify basically are governments committing millions of dollars. Sometimes, instead of a government, it's a big charity, the Bill Gates Foundation or something. Sometimes there's a big charity that really kind of behaves like a government. It has so much money. And you're trying to say to the Bill Gates Foundation or any charity like this, or you may be saying to, say, the European Union, as a federal representative of many different governments, okay, here's our situation in northwestern Laos. Here's a situation in northeast Cambodia. And this is why we want you to give us $10 million to deal with starvation, to deal with food insecurity, right? And is the problem starvation? Is the problem food insecurity? And is this the solution? All right. It's really much more slippery. It's much more difficult to deal with than these claims about military tactics. I'll just give you an example. I have lived in, slept in, I've worked in villages that were officially listed as starving. And we're my own charity, and we weren't the only ones, but we had big sacks of rice with the United Nations World Food Program logo on them. We're handing these sacks of rice to starving, quote unquote, starving people. So I'm going to say this. They're starving on paper. They're starving by decree. They're de jure starving. Okay, but I'm there on foot. I'm there in person. First problem, these people own farms. They're not farm workers. They're not factory workers. They're not living in a refugee camp. They're not, the proletariat. It's the left wing, I like to say, as Marxists like to say, right? They're not nomads. They're not homeless. Right? Now, in every society, even in a third world society, owning a farm is wealth. And if you were starving, your options would include selling the farm, right? And in case you didn't know, farms also produce food. It's not all they produce. You can produce cloth. You can produce all kinds of other things too. There are other kinds of small cottage industries like weaving on these farms. Like, weaving is an example of a cottage industry on a farm. There's real money. Okay, I got another problem for you. They own motorcycles. They own shoes. They own cellular phones. And they have connection to a cellular phone network. Now, what does starvation mean? What does food insecurity mean? I'm there in person. There is a store selling food. I'm buying food at the store, right? You could, in theory, trade your cell phone for food. You could sell your motorcycle and buy food. That's not the reality of the situation here. There's a much more difficult to understand kind of political agenda that the government of Laos is pursuing, that the government of the European Union is pursuing, that a number of different kind of foreign governments are involved in. There was a case I personally wasn't involved in, but I had a friend who was involved in the northeast of Laos, where it was specifically the government of France. It was their development project, right? You have a number of different powerful, wealthy actors. And most of the people on the ground aren't like me. Brief digression, just exactly what I'm saying. There was a project in Vientiane, the capital city of Laos, millions of dollars to preserve a swamp. UN partner agencies involved, right? Wetlands, biodiversity in the wetlands. I'm there in person, and I know the wetland does not exist. It's a construction site. A Chinese company, very directly linked to the Communist Party of China, the Chinese government. A Chinese company is building a sports stadium a number of apartment buildings. I think there's also a supermarket going in, the new roads. It's an active part of urban development. This swamp, this quote unquote wetlands. Right now, I didn't have this conversation directly myself. I talked to someone else in the humanitarian sector who said, "Oh yeah, I know the guys who run that project." And I said to them, well, so this is obviously all of a slight paraphrase. How can this project go on? How can you have international funding to save the wetlands when the wetlands don't exist? Now, very understandably, because I followed that story over a couple of years. At the time the funding proposal went in, at the time this project was proposed and international funding was secured and there were meetings, whether it was with the United Nations or exactly where they were, far distant lands. At that time, the wetlands did exist. And apparently, I was told this secondhand, the guy's attitude was, our number one priority is not to save wild animals. Our number one priority is not biodiversity conservation. Our number one priority is not any particular swamp, right? Our number one priority is to keep our office open. Particular forests come and go, particular wetlands come and go. That's my agenda. His agenda was to get the salaries of his employees paid, to get his own salary paid, right? To keep the office open, to keep the project ongoing, even if the swamp only exists on paper. This is a swamp by decree. This is a wetland by decree. Even if the wild animals and the biodiversity you're conserving is completely fictional. Okay, I know it might sound ridiculous, but who other than me would go to that village and say, the problem isn't the scarcity of food. Food here is not scarce. And the problem isn't even the poverty of the people. And now I can tell you what the problem is. It's this. And a lot of the answer to that question, what the problem is very disturbing. It's very politically upsetting to everyone involved. It's a lot of things people don't want to think about, don't want to talk about. So, if that sounds far-fetched to you, that people would lie about that, there's money involved. But there's not just money involved. There's the combination of money and the holier-than-thou ego trip of being a hero. All right? And money corrupts most people. You know what corrupts the rich? You know what corrupts people who are already born with money? It's that holier-than-thou ego trip. It's being a hero. What do you think corrupts Angelina Jolie? Angelina Jolie's got money. She's got fame. She's got beauty. She used to be considered one of the most beautiful women in the world, right? It is the delusion. It is the ego trip, right? It is this kind of false morality, right? It's being able to present yourself as a hero. That's what got her, okay? And that is a massive motivating factor for people in the military, people in government service, people in the United Nations, people in humanitarian agencies, elected and unelected people in government, bureaucrats. Okay, they want to be a hero. So it's not as simple as saying they're going to fake it just to get this next paycheck. Okay. The level of disinformation, the level of self-deception and intentional deception of others in a time of war, it's going to be even higher. It's going to be on the next level. My mother is in some ways a typical Marxist, in some ways extraordinary, in some ways exceptional. If you have really known Marxists, it's very different from reading their work on paper. If you really know Marxists face to face, one of the stunning and strange things about them is that in this subtle way, they are pro-slavery. So something Marxists said to me again and again my whole life, I've heard this from different nuances, is that what they believe in is, dialectical materialism. They believe that history passes through a series of successive stages in which one development enables and makes possible than next. It is entirely common for Marxists to say that they regard slavery in the United States of America as something positive, something that made the wealth and world domination of the United States of America possible, that America was a kind of slavery-fueled empire, that it was only because of the slavery that the United States of America, engaged in, that, they become wealthy and successful. Socratic method is dead. So tell me, within the United States of America, before the Civil War, what was the wealthiest area and what was the poorest? The areas that had slavery, were they wealthier than the areas that did not? In the 50 years or 100 years after the Civil War, what were the wealthier areas and what were the poorer? Over a few more centuries, when you compare the history of the United States of America to the history of South America, let's just say the whole Spanish Empire in South America, because today they're all separate countries, but in the past they were closely linked parts of the Spanish Empire. Havana, Cuba was this great center for slave trading that was connected to the whole of the Caribbean, the whole of South America, like what the countries that are today Venezuela, so on and so forth. They were all linked to Havana, Cuba, and they were linked to Spain. Why do you think it is? Why do you think it is that the places that had the most slavery and that sustained and continued it for the longest are today poorer than the countries that had less slavery, where the percentage of their population that was slaves was less, and that ended it first? It's a fascinating theory you've got there. But boy, if that were true, right? South America should be wealthier than North America. It should have been at every stage, like century by century or decade by decade. That should be the pattern we've seen. Gee, why is it that England became wealthier than Egypt? Right? Egypt had slavery first, and it continued having slavery the longest, like for many more years or centuries, however you want to put it, right? Egypt has a better climate, has a better location, incredible location on the Mediterranean in terms of trade going in all four directions, right? The advantages of the Egyptian empire, century by century, over the long haul, right? And if you think slavery is an advantage, Egypt should have consistently dominated every century as they went past, right? Egypt should be the most powerful, fabulous place in the world today. It should have nothing but disadvantages compared to the northwestern corner of Europe, compared to the Dutch. Gee, great theory, cool theory, bro. All right. Thinking things through all the way to their utmost extreme, dealing with the implications, dealing with the consequences of our assumptions in politics, of the solutions we're proposing. See, it's not something as simple as Socratic dialogue in the university textbook since the term, right? But there's something really important here. And I'm not going to say there was a golden age before the internet. Like, I'm not going to say, things were so much better before. But I'll tell you something. Before the internet, people used to talk about politics while sitting around a table and playing cards. Like, people did have more face-to-face interactions with people, and they had the experience of someone saying, you don't know what the fuck you're talking about, and dealing with that. The internet has made the world better in many ways. I ordered this t-shirt on the internet. I ordered this book on the internet. I wouldn't have this book without it. Maybe it's a bad book. I don't know yet. There are ways in which the internet has made the world a better place, right? But I'm very concerned about the way in which it's enabled a certain kind of self-righteous ignorance of people who go through their whole lives and they never have to think things through. They never have to deal with the implications of their beliefs. Now, in case you didn't get the subtext, I am indeed, suggesting to you that the whole Marxist view of the material development of capitalism that it's all bullshit, that it's deeply incoherent. It's not just morally wrong, that it's kind of economically and factually wrong, right? But there's a necessary next step here where we question our motivations, where we question the morality of what we're saying and what we're saying it. Why would anyone say that Russian attack helicopters are worthless, that they're useless? There's motivation there. And there's a moral choice about what kind of person you're going to be. Why would anyone say that Ukraine is winning the war? This comes back to the title of this video. It comes back to, why would anyone say that? Why would anyone even say it's a deadlock or it's even, that it's like 50-50 with both sides? If Ukraine had conquered half of the Crimea in the last few weeks, then maybe it'd be 50-50, right? You'd be able to say, hey, look, Russia has taken 50% of Western Ukraine, whatever you want to say. But at the same time, the Ukrainian troops made an advance, they made an invasion, and they conquered half of Luhansk and half of Donetsk and half of Crimea. They conquered half of the areas the Russians had formerly held. The Russians have mortar and artillery fire trained on Kiev, trained on Mariupol, trained on Odessa, trained on every single major city in Ukraine. Do the Ukrainians have any artillery fire hitting Moscow right now? Do the Ukrainians have, batteries of mortars set up and firing on St. Petersburg? Have the Ukrainians simultaneously pressed into Russian territory in retaliation? Have the Ukrainians even taken a chunk of Belarus? Oh, you think it's even? Like you think it's 50-50? You think it's, or you think the Ukrainians are winning? You think the Ukrainians are in a position to force the Russians to sign a treaty that would give back Donetsk, Luhansk, the Crimea? You think that would be winning? Do you think the Ukrainians are 1 inch closer to, in that sense, winning? This is war literacy. This is military literacy. This is just thinking through all the way the implications of the things we assume and say. Thinking through fully the way we've defined the problem, the way we're talking about the solution. And, the extent to which it's not just the left wing, the left, the right, the center, mainstream journalists, mainstream politicians, the extent to which those people are detached from the reality of war is terrifying. All right. I am afraid, I'm not afraid so much of the weakness of our leadership. I'm afraid of, the weakness of our followership. My father, grew up surrounded by World War II veterans. His own school teachers, I think all of them. He had school teachers who were physically scarred from World War I, even, not just World War II. People who had disabilities from the wars. My father went and visited Europe as a teenager when the aftermath of World War II was kind of still on the ground. Buildings were still under reconstruction and this kind of thing. Still, it was over. Don't get me wrong. It was been over for years. But the consequences of that. And I remember he told me how bitterly the Germans were still hated and how he was hated when he spoke German. He knew a few words of German. He was, in case you didn't know, he was a white Canadian who spoke English as his first language. He should have been speaking French, but as he was traveling around Europe, he was doing the backpacker tourism of his day. And I do think one of the defining problems in my father's life is that he never got this cloud of obloquy out of his life. He never escaped the shadow of the sense that he was a coward because he never fought. He never fought for anything he believed in. He didn't fight. Obviously he was too young during World War II, but he didn't fight in World War II. He didn't fight in any of the wars that came and went after that. And that instead, what he did was he developed himself into this very insincere, smart aleck communist. He developed himself into someone who supposedly, was too pure to take a side in the Vietnam War, And if you lived through those years, it was one war after another. It wasn't just the Vietnam War. The Cold War contained within it a whole lot of hot wars. Well, what about the Korean War? What about, get into really dealing with it decade by decade, conflict by conflict. I think it is completely true of my father that he never dealt with the shallow questions of what it means to be a man, to be a real man, all the toxic masculinity built into that. And he also never moved on to dealing with the deeper and more profound questions. Now, I'm not using this I could launch into a deeper, lengthier critique of my father's psychology. If you guys are interested, ask some questions. I see your questions coming into the chat. I'm a nihilist. I specifically preach a philosophy called historical nihilism. It's not just a political philosophy. It includes a philosophy of the self, philosophy of the life of the mind, philosophy of what it means to be a dissident intellectual, how to live as a dissident intellectual, how to live as an artist, philosophy of art. There's a lot to it. It's not just, politics or political science. But sure, the main thing we talk about on this channel under the heading of historical nihilism is my nihilistic approach to politics. I think, one day after I made a video here on YouTube, it was a live stream in which I was really explaining to you the ways in which all the propaganda claims about Ukraine are bullshit. Going back to the very fundamental question of what is the difference between Russia and Ukraine anyway? What is the difference between the Russian language and the Ukrainian language? Is this worth killing and dying for? I'm willing to question in a nihilistic way, to what extent is Vladimir Putin right? To what extent is Vladimir Putin right when he says the ancient origin of the Russian people is in Kievan Rus? Look it up, guys. To what extent is Vladimir Putin right when he says that the Russian people and the Ukrainian people have always been one people and they should be one nation? To what extent is that, as my point being, as unsympathetic as Vladimir Putin is, as evil as Vladimir Putin is, to what extent might he be right in some of these propaganda claims? And then, even if he's wrong, does this justify you risking your life? Like, it's one thing to say, oh, yeah, Putin's wrong. 50,000 people should die to prove the point. What if it's you, my dude? What if it's your son, your daughter? What if you have some skin in the game? What if you're risking your blood? Or even, look, guys, like maybe 2% of people die in combat in war, like 2% of people who sign up. A lot of people spend the whole fucking war just boiling potatoes. Like, you can sign up for the army, you spend the whole fucking time boiling potatoes. You work in the kitchen, and your life is not really online that way. But still, you sign up for a 3-year contract, and you lose 3 years of your life boiling potatoes, shining boots, shoveling ditches. Are you willing to risk 3 years of your life? No danger. Let's just say hypothetically, you never face a bullet or a gun or a bomb or a blade. Let's just say hypothetically, 3 years of boredom in a military camp. Are you willing to risk that? Or are you willing to risk that for your son or for your daughter? Why? To fight for the future of Ukrainian independence. But this is my point, guys. I believe it was the day after I made that video, which, it discusses it from I think it's more than an hour long, that video. Discuss it from many different angles in a nuanced way. But it certainly has this nihilistic element running through it. Okay. The day after, I got in touch with Canadian military recruiting, and I got in touch with Ukrainian military recruiting. I showed that email to some friends. I wrote an email saying, look, I'm 43 years old. I don't speak the Ukrainian language, but, here's what I have going for me. Are you guys willing to take me on? Are you willing to let me join the Ukrainian army? Okay. To fight for a cause I don't believe in. All right. Being a nihilist isn't about being lazy. Being a nihilist certainly isn't about being a pacifist. I can sit here and cynically heap scorn on this propaganda notion that Ukraine represents democracy, whereas Russia represents tyranny. That Russia represents a corrupt, bad regime, whereas Ukraine represents a morally pure, incorruptible regime. Oh, does anyone remember Poroshenko? Does anyone remember, I'm going to get her name wrong. Yulia Timofeyevich? Sorry. Oh, Jesus. Yulia Timoshenko. Yes. Poroshenko. It's a long time ago. Does anyone remember what Ukraine was like before 2014? And then how suddenly, after the Maidan protests, basically in 2015, Ukraine starts to fashion itself. Ukraine starts to present itself as this martyr for Western democracy, for supporting Western Europe, the EU, so on and so forth. I can sit here and I can set out for you a whole nihilistic analysis of what's wrong, what's bullshit about these propaganda claims. And I just did set out for you why it's bullshit to pretend like the Ukrainian soldiers are invulnerable because they have shoulder-mounted rockets when they're fighting against attack helicopters and tanks. I can say it's bullshit, it's bullshit, it's bullshit. And at the end of that conversation, I've got to ask you, what now, what next? And for my part, I actually did write in to volunteer. That's going to be on my CIA fucking rap sheet somewhere. If the CIA has a file on me, there's going to be a footnote to a footnote. At this date, he talked to Canadian military recruiters. On this date, he talked to the Ukrainian military recruiters. Support this, because I can say this is all bullshit. I don't believe in any of it. And then I can ask myself, okay, what can I do to make things better? What can I do? What's my part? So guys, by the way, this may seem like a totally unrelated example. It's related profoundly. Do you think I believe in American Indian spirituality? Do you think I have any fucking sympathy for getting high and dancing around a fireplace as a part of a ritual still carried on to this day by the Cree people, the Ojibwe people? Like, do you think that's what I'm into? Do you think, if you've seen my videos criticizing Christianity as a religion, do you think I just completely abandon my critique of monotheism when instead of Christianity, it's Native American monotheism, it's Cree, Ojibwe, wherever you are in the United States? Do you think I celebrate that? Do you think I support that? Do you think I'd want to teach my own daughter to participate in these ceremonies in a tent, in a teepee, dancing around a fireplace and getting high? It's not worth describing the details. Do you think I even believe in, say, dream interpretation within First Nations spirituality? Do you think I have any fucking sympathy at all for people interpreting dreams and hallucinations this way and ascribe significance? All right. I'm not just a nihilist from 9 to 5. It's 24/7. I'm not just a nihilist when I'm criticizing Islam or Christianity, right? I'm also a nihilist when I'm criticizing Buddhism, the religion, traditional spirituality of the Cree, of the Ojibwe, and when I'm criticizing, right? Okay. You're alive in the 21st century, all right? And I was living in Saskatchewan. I don't believe in any of this shit, right? I don't believe in any of it, okay? But what next? What now? What kind of person am I going to be? What kind of role am I going to play? What am I going to do to help? And in effect, I volunteered to be a part of the Cree language revival movement. Cree and Ojibwe, they're very close related. I signed up at the university, paid money, and poured years of my life into it. I was like, okay, I can do this. I have this skill set from working on this kind of politics and these languages, and I can be a valuable, positive part of this movement. Now, guys, but I'm a nihilist. I don't valorize Cree culture. I don't try to, I don't valorize Ukrainian culture. The Ukrainians are a bunch of meat-eating drunks. I don't like anything about Ukrainian culture. I really don't. And they're also anti-Semitic. They probably just hate me for being Jewish. There's a lot of problems with Ukrainian. There are a lot of things I don't support, and they wouldn't support about me. From their perspective, I'm a vegan Jew who wants, and maybe that's why they didn't recruit me. Maybe they say, vegan, Jewish. I don't know. Other people, I think, got an email back, but there could be other reasons why they decided I wasn't worth it. I was too old, or I only said I can do 200 push-ups and not 300 push-ups, whatever it was. My point is, it's really false to see the world and to see your role in taking action and changing the world as being built on the basis of this kind of belief. It's not that you subscribe to an ideal, you believe in something, and therefore you risk your life for it. And again, risking your life, we normally think of just, rolling the dice, as if taking a chance on death. The main way in which we risk our life, it's not facing bullets, right? The main and more important way you have to think about risking your life is risking 5 years of hard work, whether that's 5 years of hard work boiling potatoes, or 5 years of hard work studying the Chinese language, 5 years of hard work studying the Cree language, the Ojibwe language. Okay, I'm going to undertake this humble, hard work for 3 years or 5 years or whatever it is. And the risk you're taking with your life, right, in this way, it may have nothing to do with the difference between life and death. Melissa, do you have something you want to jump in with? This is a good time to comment, guys. If you want me to actually read your comments. But I don't know if you got the same one. I've got to just read Melissa's expression. Obviously, there's a lot of different stuff to think.
Yeah, obviously there are a lot of different things to talk about there, but I don't have something prepared. I was just sometimes when I'm listening to you, I don't know when you're going to stop. So I don't know if there will be an opportunity to even say anything. Look, I agree with you. Having heard so much in the last few weeks about the conflict in Ukraine and what people have to say about it, either professional journalists, I've just been embarrassed basically to watch a lot of the professional journalism discussing this subject, but also private posts that I've seen from people on my Facebook or just elsewhere online, just the level of military illiteracy. And I don't want everything to go back to ancient Greece in our conversations, but just the fact that I've read,
but everything goes back to ancient Greece.
just the fact that I've read the history of the Peloponnesian War, I really do think, although warfare has changed immensely since then, just the concept alone of reading about warfare, I think a lot of people, maybe they read about it in a history textbook in high school and then they never read it. You don't have to read anything about history. You don't have to, it's not required. So I just think a lot of people are living in complete ignorance about warfare and how we are always basically living on the edge of war at any moment in the modern age. And people like to live in a dream where this isn't the reality.
Yeah, and I would just say it is also a self-righteous dream. I mean, it's that people don't fantasize about these things in a way that's humiliating to them or challenging to them, or means they have to do a lot of hard work. They think about it in a way that puts them on this podium when they're on Instagram, when they're on Twitter, and I think, frankly, even when they talk to their own family members, where they feel empowered by the delusions they choose to embrace. Now, I have a great quote here in the audience. So this is from Ben Hodges. I don't know this. I assume this is a White House spokesperson. Let's just look up the name. Okay, so yeah, he's in effect a spokesperson for the American side here, U.S. military person. So here's a quote. Quote, absolutely, Ukraine is going to win this. Russia is not going to get into Kiev. Russia has made the decision to transition into attrition warfare. So, look, guys, I'm going to use an example. This just came up spontaneously with Melissa. It really wasn't because Melissa asked me a question. It was just that I was looking at and hearing all of this illiterate news reporting and discussion. And so out of the blue, without Melissa asking about it, I sent Melissa a series of photographs of what Russian mortar equipment looks like. So I just want to say mortar, I'm just going to give you guys the words. It is a very strange word in English language. You don't hear it often, right? In the news, what you hear about is shelling. And Melissa pointed out, she said, oh, wow, thank you for sending me this and explaining this. I'm going to tell you in a moment just what it was I explained to her. We said, oh, wow, I hear this stuff about shelling in the news, and I try to visualize what are they actually talking about? What are these shells? You don't mean shells from a pistol. What do they mean by shelling? Okay, so I sent her photographs of the particular hardware that the Russians use, mortars, okay? The word mortar in English is the same word as mortar and pestle. We still have this in modern English. Okay, it is a word just for something that's shaped like a bowl. And if you go back and look at the type of mortar in the military sense used during the Napoleonic era, and even sort of the late medieval era, they did look more like a mortar in the sense of a mortar and pestle. So this is a kind of slang term that has become formalized in the English language. It's now part of the dictionary denotation of the word mortar. They are very small. They're very cheap. They're very lightweight. I showed Melissa pictures of specific heavy mortar models that can be rolled around like golf clubs. So if you don't know, like in American culture, people have golf clubs and they have a little caddy. They have two wheels, they can roll it. And obviously, you look at the size of these things, you could load at least 20 of them onto a truck. It depends on how well you pack them into a truck. You can set up 20 mortars, right? And if you're within 10 kilometers of the target, they can then fire shells, mortar rounds, however you want to put it. They can fire incendiary shells, for example, 24/7. And it costs next to nothing. This doesn't have the kind of cost of a guided missile. The United States of America uses these very, very expensive missiles that fire from a submarine. This is really, really expensive. Try to calculate how much each missile strike costs the United States. Firing missiles, long-range missiles from a helicopter is also very expensive. Okay, having one truck deploy 20 mortars and then have 20 guys, maybe 40 guys, sit there and pop in I was going to say rockets. They're not even really rockets. They're mortar rounds, and have them shell a city. You can completely destroy a city in 24 hours. And there's no limit to how many mortars you can set up once you're in range. I said 20, you can set up 100, right? And again, each one, if you look this up, they get even smaller than that. They get really tiny. The actual size of the explosives is small, and the tube that they fire out of is very small. Right? It's likely if you put in the word artillery, you will instead get images of the largest, the most frightening Russian artillery vehicles, shall we say. And it's kind of natural. Human curiosity gravitates towards these enormous machines of war. Okay, that's not what it takes to reduce an entire city to rubble. Okay, that's not what it takes to win a war. Now, we're in a situation right now where we're going to talk about the Russian strategy in terms of what's overt and then what's hypothetically covert. On an overt level, what Vladimir Putin is saying to the Ukrainians is 100% consistent with my analysis of this war since 2014. Now, I'm going to raise the question. Like, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe what Putin's trying to do covertly is different. So I'm going to say the same. But on an overt level, what Putin is saying to the Ukrainian government is, if you want this to stop, if you want the Russians to stop dropping bombs, shelling, using mortars, using artillery, if you want the Russians to stop destroying Ukrainian cities, then the government of Ukraine has to sign a document recognizing the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk, and either recognizing the independence of Crimea or recognizing it as Russian territory, but one way or another stating that Ukraine will never again make a territorial claim, that Ukraine does not consider it Ukrainian territory, Donetsk, Luhansk, Crimea. So since 2014, that is what I thought Putin's agenda was. And at the earliest stage, like around 2015, it seemed to me then that he was maybe willing to say, let's split it 50-50. Let's pretend Ukraine has won something. Like you guys can save face. You can pretend you've won something where Russia would give back Donetsk and Luhansk, but Russia would keep Crimea. That it would be like, okay, we'll pretend it's a 50-50 split. That is not remotely a 50-50 split. So, okay, we will recognize you as Ukrainian territory, Donetsk and Luhansk, but Russia would keep, Crimea, which is really what the war is all about. Okay, so now it seems like today, unambiguously, the offer is no, you missed your chance. Like maybe if Ukraine had capitulated right back in 2014, 2015, maybe they would have gotten a better deal. But now too many years have gone by, too many years, too many billions of dollars, too many body bags. Now Russia is saying they're going to take all three, Donetsk, Luhansk, and Crimea. And if you want Kiev back, if you want the Russians to just give up their claim to the west of Ukraine or the remaining part of Ukraine, then you have to capitulate. And then that's the new 50-50. That's the new way to let Ukraine save face. Say, okay, Ukraine gets to exist at all and recognizes Russia's occupation. So that is overtly what Vladimir Putin has been saying at this point. It is possible that covertly, instead, what he wants is to just conquer and rule all of Ukraine. It's possible. Like it's possible that overt offer of peace negotiations is just 100% a dead end distraction tactic, and that actually Putin wouldn't give it to them. And if so, it's a smart tactic. It frames it in a certain way. The Western press is reporting the evacuation of the entire population of Kiev as if it's a victory for the Ukrainian side, as if it's a victory for the American side, as if it's a victory for NATO. Think about the level of cultural acceptance of cowardice we've got going on here, guys. So you're telling me running away to live in a refugee camp is victory, right? You're telling me that's bravery. You're telling me that's good. That's the Ukrainian side winning. No, it's not. It is most likely that Putin has simply been waiting for these evacuations to proceed before increasing the military pressure on Kiev and on all the other major cities. And when I say increasing the military pressure, I mean two things. One, mortar shelling, whatever you want to say, devastation through the use of explosive and incendiary shells or mortars, which can completely, you don't need anything else. That can be a sufficient tactic. As soon as you have a stable camp in range to use mortar and artillery, the war is over. Okay. Babe, it'll be too hard to find. Can you see Machiavelli's discourses?
Yes.
That's pretty cool. Just want to say, if you think this is new in terms of war literacy and war illiteracy, Machiavelli, in the discourses on Livy, he already says the old era of war is over because now we have artillery, now we have mortars. It's fundamentally the same technology. Now, as soon as the enemy is in range to use artillery and mortar fire to destroy your city, the war is done. Right? Now, the only footnote we have to add to this, so Machiavelli knew this, all right? The journalists in our time don't know this. The major political leaders in our time, I feel, don't know this. Like, maybe there are some exceptions, but most of the democratically elected leaders in the West, they do not understand this. Machiavelli, all right? You can say Machiavelli was ahead of his time. I just think he was a man of his time. The footnote you have to add to this is airplanes, aerial assault, is that you can then make a counter argument and say, well, if the enemy can come in and set up mortar fire, if they can come in and set up artillery, but you can defend yourself by sending out aircraft to destroy it, either before it fires or as soon as it starts firing. That's a counterbalancing element. We all know that's not the case in Ukraine right now. Ukraine does not have the dominance of the skies. They don't have an air force that can wipe out Russian artillery encampments, right? Russian mortar placements. But even so, if you know what happens with incendiary weapons as soon as they're fired on a city lights on fire and it burns and it's game over. Now, if the city is fully populated, you could have 1 million people die. I mean, people run away. It's unlikely to be millions. Just be honest, probably 100,000 people. it's normally just because people get up and run. I like. I was talking about this with Melissa the other day. When you're looking at the total body count for even the atom bomb, the American use of nuclear weapons in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Well, why is the body count so low? Well, people get up and move. It's not that many people in the blast radius, and people, it's even the most devastating weapons. You'd be surprised how low the body count is. But it is most likely Russia is waiting. I mean, they're keeping up the pressure. Approximately 1 million people have already fled Kiev. So maybe another million are going to flee. The city empties out, and then you can just win. You can just use incendiary mortars, and it's game over. Okay. Again, you don't have to read the fine print in the military equipment catalog and know the exact, model of the incendiary weapons, of the shells, of the mortar devices. This is very broad war literacy as opposed to war illiteracy that we're talking about. Okay, and then the other thing you can do once a significant percentage of the civilian population has evacuated is you can just occupy the city with soldiers on foot. You just have them march in and take it. And I mean, I was laughing out loud to Melissa day before yesterday or something, because I saw a Ukrainian news broadcast. This is basically propaganda from the Ukrainian side that was describing how heroically the Ukrainian people are resisting the Russians. But the actual news footage they were showing was of the Russian army parading in and occupying a city. And I say parade intentionally. The Russians who were walking in, they had no concern that they were under fire. They were not defending themselves in any way. It didn't look like the Ukrainian civilians were happy about it. People were not cheering. But all of the Ukrainian civilians there, they were accepting the Russian occupation of their city or town. That was what I was seeing on camera. I was like, well, what I'm seeing is the exact opposite. I'm seeing the total absence of armed resistance as the Russians occupy this particular place. I'm not saying it's the whole of Ukraine is like that, but I'm not seeing guerrilla resistance, guerrilla warfare, or whatever you want to say, bitter partisan, bitter end fighting. That's not what's going on here at all. And so if you just think about a parade, you got tanks and you got men on foot rolling in to occupy a town. If there is just one sniper up in an apartment building, once you're into urban warfare, there's just one team of snipers shooting down, right? What happens to your military parade, right? Like, if you think a military parade means nothing, you think it's just symbolic. No, it demonstrates the total absence of guerrilla resistance, guerrilla warfare. But this is not Vietnam. The reality on the ground of the Ukrainians who have capitulated, the Ukrainians who are today living under Russian occupation, some of whom have been under occupation since 2014, right? The reality on the ground is not. It's not like the Vietnam War. It's not at all. And by the way, I do know the history of the Vietnam War. A very small percentage of the Vietnamese people supported communism. Like, that's the reality. Many Vietnamese, they wanted an independent democratic country. They didn't want to be ruled by communists. It wasn't the case that they had massive support at the ground level. It was very, internally, the divisions between different Vietnamese political camps, those are intensely felt, and they were to some extent killing each other. They weren't just killing Americans.
I'll just say I really like this discussion. I really like what you've had to say about cowardice and just being nihilistic about even what you hear on the news, living with this every day, not 9 to 5, 24 hours, 7 days a week. I live with no belief in what I hear on the news. I'm not going to put my faith in somebody saying, no, Ukraine is winning. If you just do a little bit of analysis, it's more analysis than a little that you've fleshed out in this video so far. But if you really do think it all the way through, examining just a simple statement like that, like, yes, Ukraine is winning.
Yes. Right.
What does that mean?
Right.
And exactly what you're saying here.
Right.
They don't even have, the Ukrainian army doesn't even have snipers that are willing to shoot at people during this military parade. Yeah, as you said. Yeah. So,
And again, by the way, have a human heart. Think about it from the other side. Think about if you were one of the Russian soldiers and you were facing these conditions too. I mean, again, sympathy is an analytical tool. You may find it hard to sympathize with Vladimir Putin specifically, or hard to sympathize with the specific soldiers that are on the ground. But take the time to do it, and even just visualizing those things and thinking it through. I think it helps you get over some of these propaganda notions. I'm mostly hearing left-wing propaganda about this. I'm not seeing a lot of right-wing propaganda. But, really, really, really deal with them. Just thinking about, well, what if it were me who had a shoulder-mounted rocket and I'm going to take out a group of attack helicopters? Like, gee, this starts to seem implausible. If imagine if it, sorry, just thinking that through. Well, what if I were in Mariupol trying to resist the army occupying the city, and they like step by step? Anyway, go on, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And just the basis for this is outrage and seeing people dying in war. When people are dying in war, and we've just been ignoring it. So that by itself is enough to just totally incapacitate people's ability to reason through this. They see this horrifying image. They think this is terrible. The Russians are clearly the evil side. I have to stand up and shout to anyone who will listen that this is horrible. Number one, yes, this complete illiteracy in warfare. Two, completely just disregarding what happened in 2014.
Yes,
that the Ukraine was already invaded in 2014, and there was shelling in 2014. I just saw footage of it the other day, and nobody. I don't remember that at all. This kind of outcry, this outrage at that shelling at that time.
Right.
But just the immobilizing of people's brain power in this. What you said about Kiev being the center of Russia at one time.
Yes, Kiev and Rus. Just to be clear, that is the origin of the Russian nation. So it's not just at one time Kiev was the capital. It's kind of at the most important time. It's their foundational myth. It's the origin of the nationality of Russia, not just the country of the empire, is Kiev and Rus. It's the city of Kiev. That's where the story begins. That's where chapter 1 of your history textbook begins for history of Russia, whether at the primary school level, high school level, or university level. Go on.
Yes. So I admit my ignorance on this level. I mean that you told me about this. Oliver sent me Oliver Shields, a fan of your channel, and also has his own YouTube channel. So he sent me, this document about the Republic of Novgorod. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, but just this level of history, learning about, how many people who are standing up and denouncing Russia for this have any grasp on it. And like you said, I know a lot of people might understand it, but they wouldn't send their own daughter or son into war. Of course, that's a different level. But just like being able to admit, like, oh, okay, maybe there's some legitimacy to this, to what's going on. He's not just a madman.
Okay, so repeat this very briefly. Like, the discussion wouldn't be worth having if one side were totally good and one side were totally evil. Like, so I've discussed this. I also have a book chapter. Chapter 4 of my book is on Patreon right now. If you pay $1 on Patreon, you can read the first 4 chapters of The Future of an Illusion. And I don't even know. You can read a lot of my other book too, No More Manifestos. So there's a lot of work. But this is one of the things I've recently put emphasis on is, recognizing in a nuanced way what is good within the evil side's argument or what have you. That's really important. That's really an aspect of maturity in politics. Adolf Hitler was opposed to cigarette smoking, was opposed to women drinking alcohol during pregnancy. Now, he was wrong about almost everything else. I mean, Adolf Hitler, I really do think he was a moron. I think he was an incredibly stupid person. Really. I mean, a lot of people have this, a lot of people talk about this kind of evil genius trope. I don't think he was an evil genius at all. I think he was an idiot. But, again, understanding, the complexity and contradiction and really dealing with it. And then understanding what is still to people to this day. What is appealing to people about Nazism and neo-Nazism, why it still matters today. And it matters right now in the Ukraine conflict, in case you hadn't heard why this comes up. again and again this way, and then dealing with that. So this is important in all these different fields. But look, in terms of a one-sided, so a great question from Spen. Spen says, "Can I get the book some other way?" So Spen, that particular book, I was going to publish it today, but maybe tomorrow, the next day. Veganism: The Future of an Illusion. That will be for sale on Amazon.com, really within just a couple of days. The other book is taking longer. The other book is called No More Manifestos. So I don't know, a couple of weeks or something. But yeah, you can get them on Amazon. And I'm just being honest with you, I don't know how much it'll cost. I'm going to put it as cheap as I can, kind of thing. But there's some details you don't know until like you don't know until the end. I can't promise you any particular price at this minute because I don't know how the system works to that level. Anyway, dealing with, but anyway, I'm dealing with Amazon self-publishing for both. So yes, the short answer is yes. And frankly, even if you are supporting me on Patreon, I hope people will go and read the book that way. Anyway, sorry, pleasant distraction. Thanks for the question. Myanmar. Okay. Some people sincerely support Vladimir Putin, East and West. Like there are some Americans who are pro-Russia and pro-Putin, and so we're talking about people sincerely. Now, if you step down a level into the insincere and cynical support for Russia, some people are making a lot of money out of the oil industry. Some people have corporate concerns and investment concerns. Some of them have reasons to support Russia or to tolerate Vladimir Putin because they're making millions of dollars, whatever the situation is. Like there are business interests and these kinds of things. There are people who are into conciliation and cooperation for insincere reasons, but there are people who sincerely support. Okay, that's Russia. That's Putin. When you talk about Myanmar, talk about the fucking military dictatorship in Myanmar. Nobody supports them. Nobody sympathizes with them. Like that's closer to like pure evil in terms of politics than even like during his first election, during like we talk about the first couple months of the regime of Adolf Hitler. There were all kinds of people, including the Prime Minister of Canada, who were super optimistic about Hitler. They were like, "Oh, hey, this is going to work out," well, some of them later regretted. The psychologist Carl Jung, hilarious. Go back and read Carl Jung's support for Adolf Hitler. Oh yeah, and he did later regret it. And some people praise his later writing where he's regretting it. I don't forgive you, Carl Jung. I think there's a really deep judgment of who that dude was. All kinds of people were optimistic about this. And again, like sympathy is an analytical tool. I'm not asking you to have sympathy for the devil. So you can just sit around and weep in your shreddies, weep in your breakfast cereal. My point is you can sympathize in order to understand the phenomenon, right? So in this sense, Myanmar, after so many decades of suffering and sorrow, they finally returned to democracy, deeply flawed democracy, semi-democracy, blah, 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 blah. They finally reinstalled Aung San Suu Kyi in a kind of symbolic leadership role, right? She wasn't really, in terms of political power, the leader, but okay, she was not in prison anymore. So this fragile, frail old woman who's not vegan. She's not. She'd live a longer, healthier life if you were vegan. Convert Aung San Suu Kyi to veganism, guys. Okay, so there was this progress, there was this hope for Myanmar. Nobody supports this military dictatorship, not even communist China. They're not happy about it. They're like willing to tolerate it because business is business. They have their own policy and approach to these things. You think Nepal is happy about it? You think India is happy about it? You think Malaysia is happy about it? Not even Cambodia. Not even Hun Sen, the leader of Cambodia. Nobody's happy about this. What the fuck are you going to do about it, homeboy? Now, look, I have had to ask myself at many, many different points in my life if I was going to learn the Burmese language. I've had to ask myself at many different points in my life if I was going to learn one of the ethnic minority languages within Burma. So languages like Shan, languages like Mon, all right? Like I can't count. I would have to sit here and think. Like there were many different kind of junctures in my life where I sat down and was seriously looking at committing myself to learning one of these languages. Again, whether Burmese or one of the minority languages in Burma. Like I'd have to go down and list for you. It's probably 10 different points in my life. But one that was very memorable and, emotionally moving for me just a couple of days before my daughter was born. So I'm divorced. This is when I was together with my ex-wife. And I forget if this was 4 days before or what, but it was in the period where we're just getting ready for the birth. And you never know exactly when it's going to be. So whether it was 4 days or 7 days or 2 days, but in the days leading up to the birth, and you got everything prepared, and I'm doing all, I'm doing all the cooking and cleaning. My ex-wife is putting her feet up and making a lot of vegan macaroni and cheese, this kind of stuff. But we're sitting around, and I said to her then, it was just in the lead up. In some ways you have a lot of time. You're really just waiting to give birth, kind of thing. And there were violent political events in Burma at that time. And I said to her, look, will you let me show you? Because she had her own scholarly background in languages and politics of Asia. And I was like, look, we could do this. Like, you and me can make the decision today, and we can really go into Burma. We can specialize in Burmese politics, including the ethnic minority. And I was trying to show her how the writing system works, just saying, so I can read and write Burmese because I learned Pali. It's like learning Latin and then you study Italian, except it's way harder because it's Southeast Asia. But there's this ancient language I'd already learned, and I learned to read and write it in the Burmese tradition. And I was trying to show her and the ways in which Burmese was similar to languages she had studied. And of course, she already knew it's connected to history and politics. And I remember my ex-wife being so kind of contemptuous and bitchy in response to this, that I got very upset. I said to her, like what, what's the matter with you? Like, I'm trying to talk to you seriously about what we're going to do with the next 10 years of our lives, like what we're doing politically and what we're doing intellectually, because she had given up on like 5 different things she'd been doing with her career. I had been forced to give up on 5 different things I was doing with my life. I didn't want to. She made decisions that forced me to completely throw everything I was doing in the garbage. I'm looking for hope and belief in the future and how I can make a positive difference in the world. And I'm saying there, seriously, look, we can just, and it has everything to do with doing it together. If you guys haven't studied a language, sitting alone with a book is very different from just having one other person who's doing the speaking exercise with you. Like, we could do this together, and she could take her background and I could take my background. We could go into this and make a difference. Now, just saying, this is not a boast, but obviously that's true. Some of you know who my ex-wife was or who she is. Put it this way. Not only is it true that I could have made a difference in Burmese politics, and my ex-wife could have made a difference in Burmese politics, and not only is it true that we could have made more of a difference together and learning to read and write language together. If you think about who my ex-wife was and what her PhD prepared her to be able to do, like what paths she could have taken, right, after finishing her PhD, right? Actually, that's probably the biggest difference she could have made. That's probably the best path she could have gone on to get into Burmese, whether mainstream Burmese or an ethnic minority tradition of Burmese like Shan. Actually, like if you compare it to what difference could she have made in Beijing, China, good luck. what we have to ask ourselves all the time, what difference is going to make in Taiwan even? That's actually a place where at that time, and then in the 10 years that followed, we're coming up on 10 years since I split up with my ex-wife. Not yet, but anyway. So again, it's not just a hollow boast, but you think about opportunity cost. Okay. My point is, again, we're not just talking about risking your life. It's not just saying to you, hey, strap on a bandolier. Hey, you can be, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something, even if you try, even if that's what you sign up for, most of the guys who sign up to join the army thinking they're going to be Arnold Schwarzenegger, they're peeling potatoes, they're carrying sacks of ammunition, they're digging trenches, they're doing all kinds of mundane tasks that make the military operation possible, or worse, whatever. Really, you can find your whole military career can be doing paperwork, and you feel that's not what you signed up for. Well, guess what? You signed up to follow orders, not give orders. And, you may have thought you signed up to be a hero. You don't get to be a hero. And you may, even worse, you sign up to be a hero, you end up committing crimes against humanity. And let me just digress to say this. There are a lot of people in the media now making a big deal out of the fact that some of the Ukrainians are neo-Nazis. All right? If you make the decision to sign up to join the U.S. Army right now, because you support Joe Biden's policy. Let's just say you're a moderate centrist. You support Joe Biden's policy. If you sign up and join the U.S. Army, do you think you won't work with neo-Nazis? Do you think you won't have a guy in your unit who can fucking shoot a machine gun like nobody else? Like, yeah, that guy's our best gunner, and he's a fucking neo-Nazi, and you get along with them, and you break bread, you eat lunch with that fucking neo-Nazi. It's hard. That's what war entails. War entails that someone who would be your worst enemy in peacetime becomes your best friend because he knows how to shoot a fucking machine gun. He's actually good at his job. And that's the guy you rely on to pull the fucking trigger. And Brad, he's kind of a fucking neo-Nazi, but and the reverse is true too. There's some fucking neo-Nazi like Brad. He signs up, whatever, because maybe he wanted to fight against the Taliban, whatever he wanted to fight against, and his best friend becomes a translator who's ethnically, Arab. He's racist against Arabs, but now his best friend is an Arab translator. He signs up and he has a close friendship with a black guy who's also really good at firing a machine gun. That's what war does. That's what war does to people, for better and for worse. Right now, if you're on a fucking U.S. military base in Virginia, you will have friends and colleagues who are neo-Nazis in the United States of America. Do you want to venture a guess what percentage of men in service in the American Army right now are neo-Nazis? Nobody wants to know. You think the research is hard to do? It's not hard to do. You think the CIA doesn't have a fucking button they can press that's based on filtering and reviewing every single email sent and received by every single man on active military duty? You think they can't press a fucking button and tell you right now what percentage of people in the U.S. Army are neo-Nazis? It's one button. You think, look, all armies do this, okay? Right now, let's say you're the government of Israel. You need to know how many of your own soldiers are religious fanatics of various kinds. Of course, every email, every text message from every phone for anyone who's in the Israeli military, of course, they're filtering it for keywords. Of course they are. Of course, they want to know how many guys in active duty in the Israeli army, how many are left-wing wingnuts, let's put it that way, a little bit crazy on the left wing. How many are right-wing wingnuts? How many, and even just within Judaism, how many of them are moderately religious? And some of them are, how many are really religious to the point where this could be a problem? This could be a problem in a battlefield situation in terms of a trust, in terms of intelligence, in terms of reliability. You think nobody in the fucking CIA knows how many of these guys are neo-Nazis? They work with neo-Nazis because that is war. There's a guy here in Canada. If you Google, you'll find this guy. But I don't even want to use his fucking name. There's a guy here in Canada who finished a university degree, and I forget if he was 25 or 30, but he was older than the average Army recruit. But he'd finished his university degree, and he was the stereotypical Antifa left-winger. He identified as both an anarchist and a communist. They try to play this game like, oh, you can take anarchism and communism and call it anarcho-communism. It's like you can take freedom and tyranny and you fucking kidding me, you piece of shit. But he was playing the same game the Antifa people were like, oh, it's not communism, it's anarcho-communism. He was one of these pieces of shit from my perspective, but he was university educated and he signed up to fight in Afghanistan. In case you didn't know, I signed up to fight against ISIS not that many years ago. Didn't work out for some reason, Canadian Army. And that's on my record too. If I now apply for a visa to go back to China, if I apply for a visa to go back to Thailand, you think their government can't press a button and just see a record of, oh, he signed up to join the army? And of course they can. Of course they can. Any well-organized military government in the world. And whatever, you apply for a business visa, you apply for a student visa, of course they can. And they can press a button and see, oh, this person, what are their religious views? Of course. What do you think email exists for? And if they couldn't, you'd say they were incompetent. If they couldn't, you'd complain. You'd say, why didn't the government catch this guy when the next terrorist attack happens? Of course they do. They do that for giving visas, people who apply for visas. course, they do it for people signing up for the military or specific military service. Anyway, there was this piece of shit left-wing extremist in the Canadian Army, and he went and got himself killed. I forget if he died in Afghanistan or if he died in Iraq. I'm sorry, I just forget which one. But, I relate to this story on many different levels. But there was this attempt in the Canadian mainstream media, and I 100% assume it was like handed to them by the federal government, the government of Canada, to make this guy into a hero. Like, oh, here's this really good guy. Here's this really morally good person who signed up to fight and die, and he fought and he died, Okay, so I can sit here and say, oh, this guy is a communist. This guy is a whatever. He's this kind of college boy, phony, anarcho. Okay, all right. But if I were deployed with him, if I were digging a trench with him and living in a tent with him and I'm fighting in the war with him, right? That's what war does. It brings communists and fascists together. It brings all kinds of people together who otherwise would hate each other, right? To fight or die. That's the kind of clarity that violence brings to human life. Okay, great question from Javier. Nice to hear from you, Javier. And I got your email and replied to you a couple hours ago. Javier asks, quote, how do you approach the idea of primary sources in a topic that is unfolding in real time like this? Great question. With all this misleading information, how do you cope with reading primary source documents? I mean, in a sense, informally, I'm saying this to Melissa all the time. Like, it's not something I normally do broadcasts about or write articles about. It's like what I hate about the mainstream media and Twitter, and what I hate about the way in which mainstream media relies on Twitter. Like, you have journalists and their form of research is reading things on Twitter and quoting people on Twitter, is this really strange way in which they disregard the motivations for people saying these things. So, to give you an example, I was just shouting just for the sake of being more entertaining in the conversation to Melissa. But like, I see these YouTubers reporting on news stories saying, oh, the Ukrainian side, it has these strategically important missiles. It's like, if they had strategically important missiles, they would not be in the newspaper. They would not be encouraging you to talk about this on Twitter and on YouTube. Like, the strategically important missiles in this conflict are the missiles nobody knows about, and that they would literally kill you for talking about or revealing the location of, as opposed to like these propaganda photos that are being actively given to you and shared, right? Now, I'm just pointing out, that's not even talking about news being fake or misleading. It's just about recognizing what the motivations of people are in creating and sharing and propounding news this way. Sorry, it's the simplest thing to say, but people are saying this for a reason. And when people are silent, they're silent for a reason, and things are secret for a reason. And some of the things that nobody is talking about are more significant than what is being shared and propounded openly. So I've raised the issue again and again of, what about Syria? What about what the Israeli army and Israeli intelligence are doing in Syria now, because the Russian position there has been vitiated? Whatever you want to say, the Russian position there is the excuses for tolerating the Russian cooperation with the Assad regime in Syria, those have ended. So now that attacking the Russians in Syria is fair game, what happens? What are the Israelis going to do? What have they already done secretly? Like, what is, because a lot of what Israeli intelligence and the Israeli military does. I remember that day one when the Syrian civil war popped off. Israeli intelligence, Israeli military, and even the Israeli Air Force, they went in and did a whole lot of things, which, I'm not saying not saying nobody mentioned it in the news, but there's very little recognition or discussion of that and how important it was strategically. So you have Israeli making moves there. And another one I've drawn attention to repeatedly is what's happening on Sakhalin Island. What's happening on the Kuril Islands, what's happening on the disputed border between Japan and Russia. And I've been sending Melissa links about this. And, Melissa sent me a screenshot of a YouTube comment where someone in Ukraine, someone who was Ukrainian said, hey, Japan, you guys should now invade Russia and take back, reconquer Sakhalin Island, reconquer the Kuril Islands. Now is your chance because we have this war with Russia. Again, these things aren't secret. Nobody's talking about it. I listen to the Japanese news, and a certain percentage of the Japanese news consists of direct propaganda statements of the Japanese government, and they have stepped up the propaganda on this. Japan is openly saying, well, guess what? We're not happy about our border with Russia. Guess what? We don't accept this. We don't accept it. A bunch of tough talk. Can you back it up? You're going to do something. Well, okay. So again, some of my analysis, it has already proven to be true. I mean, some of my analysis from 2014 proved to be true also, but some of my analysis from just a few weeks ago, it has played out in this way. There are these other fronts. Another one is what Turkey is going to do. I think there's no point speculating about that. But, there's certainly best case and worst case scenarios there. So the answer to this question is you just have to look at all reasoning as motivated reasoning and all communication as having a very definite intention. Like, you look at these statements, and for every one of the statements, whether it's from a government or from a journalist, you can add, and that's what they want you to think. That's what they want you to know. And, there is an agenda here. So I would say for me, it's not that hard to cope with. But you think about the background I come out of. What does anyone say about the history of slavery in Thailand? Well, that's what they want you to think. That's what they want you to know. And then there's all these things that are not being said. What does anyone say about the history of Buddhism and how the Buddhist religion was connected to slavery in Thailand? Oh, what happens if you're the one guy, even at Cambridge, England, even in Oxford, England? What if you're the one guy willing to talk about slavery and Buddhism in the history of Thailand? And then, there's a lot of silence and then these intentional statements. But, in my experience, even dealing with the history of French colonialism in Cambodia, in Laos, and so on, it's amazing the extent to which you're always dealing with this kind of motivated reasoning. So, I just say for me, I'm just being honest. This is just subjective. For me, it's not different. For me, it's not a change to shift over to deal with primary sources right now as history unfolds and how deceptive they are, how they engage in deception. And I think, if anything, what's hard to deal with is the possibility that people are just telling you the truth. Just real briefly, so I want to hear what most going to say something. But what if when Vladimir Putin says this, he's actually telling the truth? That's possible. What if when Joe Biden says this? Go back, watch my video on Joe Biden's secret plan for the Indo-Pacific. There's this possibility that this really is Joe Biden's plan. This really is American foreign policy the next 10, 20 years. We don't know. So that's actually in some ways harder to deal with, is what if it's not deception? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to comment about your article that you posted many years ago about Sakhalin Island and about the indigenous question of the indigenous people of Sakhalin Island. So I was just reading it because you shared it to your Patreon, and I wanted to point out just this part. You were analyzing a government document from Russia, from the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So they were categorizing, or they were characterizing Sakhalin as being part of Russia immemorial.
I remember that phrasing.
Yes.
Since time immemorial. This is.
But then the next section was about how the indigenous people were now having to live in different houses. They were having to live in a totally different society and with a different culture than they ever had before. So this is this direct opposition that that was a primary source. I mean, that's the government source. You know, you have to be conscious of that when you're listening to President Biden today, when you're listening to even Zelensky today. You know, like.
Right. Look, you know, but I mean, I'm used to it. I mean, I guess it's just I read all primary sources this way for any historical period, any context. You know, one of the ones that's a real laugh is when did Yunnan become part of China? Now, if you want to talk about Tibet, this is even more uncomfortable. When did Tibet become part of China? You know, but when did Yunnan become part of China? When did Dehong become part of China? When did Sichuan-Pana in Chinese pronunciation? When did Sichuan-Pana become part of China? What all Chinese will tell you, and including Chinese who admit that this is a lie 5 minutes after you show you're not an idiot, is since the Han Dynasty. So the Han Dynasty starts in 206 BC. Since the Han Dynasty. So you know, this is kind of normal. You know, sorry, it's false. In case you weren't guessing what I'm saying, this is a lie. People lie this way, you know, constantly, and they lie when they have nothing to gain. So, you know, I mean, when I was younger, I regarded these lies as intentional. As I've gotten older, I've really had to appreciate how stupid most people are most of the time. So, in some ways, I've become more morally permissive, but more intellectually demanding, where I blame stupidity more and I blame evil and intentional dishonesty less. Most countries exist with this type of very deep contradiction, you know, within themselves. China has many. China has numerous. You know, I saw lately. I've seen many interviews from Russia, but one of the recurring leitmotifs when people in Russia today, this is like within the last 2 weeks, right now in Russia, when they want to say that they don't really support the conquest of Ukraine, but they're saying it kind of polite. You know, they're not being trenchant. They'll often say, "Oh, you know, Russia is so big already." You know, it's like, yeah, but why would we need to conquer Ukraine? It's such an enormous country. We just have so much land, we have so much territory already. And a couple people said, you know, these are just man on the street interviews, random, normal Russians, and these are the people who want to politely and vaguely oppose the war, not trenchantly oppose the war. But some of them said, you know, Russia's problem is that we're underpopulated, not that we are overpopulated and don't have enough land. But, you know, Russia is so big. Russia has so much land already. For how long has Sakhalin Island been a part of Russia? For how long has Siberia been a part of Russia? What really is the moral relationship between the Russian nationality, which is deeply involved with Ukraine, with Kiev and Rus and so on, and Kazakhstan and Central Asia? Like, okay, like if this is your justification, which is in some ways understandable, it's irredentism. If you don't know that term in politics, it's very good to know. So if you have an irredentist justification for conquering Ukraine, that this is part of the ancient homeland of Russia. Well, you know, looking a little bit further east, you have a whole lot of territory that's somebody else's, that somebody else is indigenous to, you know. And sorry, but it's this massive issue staring you in the face, including, I mean, as I've mentioned, the border with Japan is a huge and obvious and terrible one.
Yeah, I just want to say maybe this is too, I don't know if it's on the nose or this is too ironical to talk about it in this way. To hear Americans critiquing the invasion of Ukraine as a genocide.
Yes.
Now, I know a lot of people in America, they don't even have ancestors who were involved with the genocide of the Native population in the United States. However, just the kind of panic and outrage that I've been hearing from the American media, it's just hypocritical in this way, because the American empire is based on genocide, and it came up the last time you were talking about this, the annexation of Hawaii. Well, today,
Right.
why is Hawaii part of the United States, and Guam, like
Yeah.
these, the Marshall Islands, and all of this, it's kind of hypocritical to
Right.
criticize Russia in this way. Although I
Right.
certainly it's
But we still hate Vladimir Putin.
yeah, we still hate yes.
But
Yeah.
we can recognize the hypocrisy in one side's arguments.
Yes,
So,
and the fact that they've eliminated the native population, the fact that
yes.
the colonists eliminated the population to such an extent that they couldn't fight back, and there was just they failed. They failed to fight back.
So I want to jump in here. The other propaganda-based parallelism we see in the press today, I hear it again and again and again, is the comparison between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's hypothetical invasion of Taiwan. Let me ask you, where is the ancient origin of Chinese civilization? If you open a textbook, even if you choose intentionally to open the Chinese history textbook used by the Chinese government itself, used by school children, high school students, university students in China, like the official history approved by the government of China. Do you think in chapter 1, what's this? Chapter 1, the ancient origins of the Chinese people, do you think Taiwan is even on the map? Like, at what point does Taiwan enter that history? At what point does it become an important place? But the Chinese people do not have the delusion that Taiwan is part of their ancient homeland. Taiwan's indigenous people are not Chinese. Taiwan's indigenous languages are not Chinese. When Europeans first arrived in Taiwan, the traders and Christian missionaries who got off the boat did not encounter Chinese people. They encountered the Aboriginal people, the indigenous people, whatever you want to say, the native people who were not Chinese. And indeed, the expansion of Chinese hegemony over Taiwan, it was partly a response to European colonialism. The threat that, if China doesn't expand its sphere to control this type of formerly unimportant island, if they don't take over a greater role in dominating this island, maybe Europeans are going to use it as a trading outpost or what have you. And so the other thing I'm skipping here is the importance of piracy. Europeans, they're an interesting piece of the puzzle, but actually the other big problem, the Chinese, from Beijing's perspective or from Nanjing's perspective, but from the mainland Chinese perspective, the other problem was controlling piracy. So if you allowed this island to remain this kind of lawless frontier, controlling the indigenous people wasn't a problem, but these became harbors used by pirates, and some of the pirates were very powerful. They were not easy to oppose on sea. Okay, so this is a digression, but it's a very significant one. Okay, every Russian child, even if you're Russian growing up in the United States of America, like you're not part of but you're ethnically Russian and you get interested in the history of Russia, when you open that textbook, page 1 is chapter 1 is going to deal with Kievan Rus. The story begins with this seminal period where the center of Russia and the origin of the Russian people was in Kiev, is in the area that's now Ukraine. And Moscow doesn't exist, and it isn't mentioned for many centuries. I'm sorry, I don't have it memorized how many centuries it is. But, and of course, when Moscow first is mentioned, it isn't an important place yet. It isn't the center of a great empire yet. But Moscow was a distant, remote, uncivilized place, and the beginnings of Russian history are there in Kiev. Do I sympathize with Vladimir Putin? No. Do I support Putin in this? No. I support democracy. I also don't build my own politics on claims about ancient homelands and ethnic identity and this kind of thing. That's not my approach to politics. But You know, I said this many times to friends of mine, and they're often shocked, like face-to-face conversations. I remember being in Cambodia and saying to this guy, I really hate him now, but he's a friend of mine at the time. This frenemy of mine, kind of colleague and frenemy, but later I learned to hate the guy. I remember saying to him, you know, the indigenous people of Germany are German. Like the way you're using the concept of indigenous, like it's false. Like indigenous doesn't mean tribal. Indigenous doesn't mean poor. Indigenous doesn't mean backward or something. Like it doesn't have any, like you're using the word indigenous in a way that's really false. And like, I hate to tell you this, but like, so we were dealing mostly with Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand and stuff. But like, you can't talk about Cambodia as if the Cambodian people are not indigenous. Like this doesn't make sense, you know? So really dealing with this, it's something we have to deal with in politics all the time. And by the way, look, Cambodia has a terrible system of government right now. There's an argument that Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar could all become one country. You know what I mean? Like the fact that you recognize the Cambodian people are indigenous to Thailand, that doesn't mean the best thing for them is to have sovereignty in a separate state. There's an argument that all of those countries could modernize and improve by integrating and creating a larger, newer country. Just to give an example, like the fact that you recognize the importance of this kind of ancient history doesn't mean that you let it dictate all political outcomes forever. Certainly, until a few weeks ago, nobody thought it was the destiny of Russia to reconquer Kiev and reunify, modern Russia with the territory of ancient Kievan Rus. That idea existed. I mean, certainly, I think everyone has just read an intro to Russian history textbook. I think that idea has been around, but Vladimir Putin successfully moved it up from a footnote to history to a major priority. He's made it into the grand arc of Russian history, being the reunification of the Russian people, and yes, the reunification of Moscow and Kiev. So just pointing out, there were very real propaganda reasons to create this parallel between Russia's invasion of Ukraine and China's hypothetical invasion of Taiwan. But that parallelism is in many ways profoundly misleading.
I don't want to get too far off topic, but I want to say I appreciate that you said that you don't live with this belief that wherever a group of people are indigenous to, live with the irredentist belief that, you've had the experience of moving to places, around the world and having to really consider, am I going to live here the rest of my life? Is this going to become my culture? We're living at all times it's a choice where we're living and what country we're trying to identify with the politics, identify with the culture, the history, the language. And for you in particular, like I really admire that about you. And I of course, of course, I admire you for many reasons.
There's a lot of things Shelley's spoken.
Yes. So I know I recognize that I have some bias in this, but I really do admire that you made the effort to learn Korean Ojibwe, that if you're going to live in Canada, that you're going to try to learn the native language of the indigenous population. And this, in a sense, I believe is maybe I shouldn't say I believe because I'm trying to be a nihilist here. No, I'm just kidding. But this in effect, like you are living separate from this idea of indigenous, right? So,
yes.
I'm not going to move to Norway and think just because this is my blood that I'm going to fit in here. This is, really, I can't help that.
You're not entitled to have a voice in Norwegian politics because of your blood, just making it more real, more specific. However, if you spent 5 years studying the Norwegian language, like 5 years isn't that long a time, you could put in the work and then all of a sudden you really are entitled. You really are part of it,
Yes.
And we're on,
Yes, right. So when you think about this, maybe you could do this also in Myanmar, as you talked about, this possibility of studying the Burmese language and really making a difference in this critical conflict. Just living with that too. Most people they have no control over where they're born, of course. But at a certain point, you have to live with your where you are choosing to live and what kind of cultural assumptions you have to
Yeah.
work with.
Yep. So no, you're right. She's drawing out something explicitly that within this broadcast has been implicit, that I think that this type of responsibility is a choice, that you can take it on. You know, you can be ethnically black and choose to become, politically and intellectually Japanese. Now, the Japanese people are racist. The Japanese people are xenophobic. There's a sense in which they'll never accept you. But you can imagine, let's say it's a Black American who's very passionate about martial arts. Okay, let's just leave it at that. Just have a simple example. And it's a Black guy who becomes totally fluent in Japanese, and he becomes some kind of karate champion or martial arts champion in Japan. Let's say he appears on TV a couple times and does some interviews. Then he opens up his own martial arts school. There's a sense in which people will always be racist against him. Even if he speaks Japanese perfectly and he, can read and write after so many decades. And there will be some, but still, after some number of years and some level of commitment and some mastery that they respect you for. Again, you can be a martial artist. You could be a medical doctor. I mean, you can do anything, just something that people respect. At some point, he's earned his right to have a voice. So my point is, this is something you take on. It doesn't exist passively because of your blood or from where you happen to be born, but it's work, no matter where you are. It's work. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. Just a parallel example. One of the videos that you sent me about Sakhalin Island, and there was an interview of an ethnically Japanese man who was raised learning Russian, speaking Russian, and he's identifying as Russian.
Yep.
He says, "I would feel like a foreigner in Japan." This is just the reality. So in this sense, like if we have democracy in Ukraine, in Russia, if we have democracy in Hawaii, shouldn't we all have the opportunity to say, well, if we want independence, we all have to vote for it. If we want to have, sorry to be, making such a broad proclamation here, but it's just, this is the real issue here, is that people in Ukraine and people in Russia don't have this choice.
Yep. Well, and I think that really is the great unanswered question for the 21st century. And probably it will still be the great unanswered question for the 22nd century. I just doubt we're going to wrap it up within the next 80 years. What about direct democracy? And, France is not that big a country. There are some provinces in France that might want independence. Spain is not that big a country. Already, there are a couple different provinces in Spain that might want independence. This is a very simple, challenge for direct democracy. Can you decide that through a plebiscite? Can you decide that through a referendum? Well, take a few more steps and start really dealing with the implications for direct democracy in the 21st century and the 22nd century. That is the great unanswered question. And I think at this time, a lot of people have a sense of its danger. I think a lot of people don't even want to ask it. I have not seen a single news broadcast entertain the question of what Americans would say if you directly had a referendum about whether or not America should help Ukraine, whether or not you could have a question, should Americans be allowed to volunteer to join a military corps that will go over and fight in Ukraine against the Russians? Like, if that were the question, like, we're not committing everyone to fight, but we're going to have a volunteer wing of the army where men who are already in the army can volunteer, and also members of the public can volunteer to join, who will go and fight without being drafted, without being forced to go and fight the Ukraine war. What percentage of Americans would vote yes for that today? Now it's different in 2014 and 2015. That's different today in 2022 and March 12th. That's tomorrow. If tomorrow people vote on that, woo! I'm just saying, I've only lived in the United States for very short periods of time. I don't have a lot of what percentage of Texans would vote? I think a very large percentage. What percentage of New Yorkers? Americans love democracy. Americans love to fight for democracy. A fight like this, and they've all been seeing the same news broadcasts. I don't know, but it is very easy for me to imagine more than 55% of Americans would say, yes, let's go fight the Russians, or let's allow people who want to fight the Russians to fight. I think there were a lot of tough Americans who were willing to take that chance. Hey, here's a great question. What if Japan had that kind of, that kind of referendum? Now, I just want to say about the Japanese people, you guys know I have studied Japanese politics formally in university and also as my own interest. There is this reputation the Japanese have that they're just a bunch of pussies. They're just that they don't like to fight, neither in terms of face-to-face conflict nor war or whatever else. Well, there's another side to Japanese culture, and it's really the side of their culture they keep out of the movies and they keep off of TV. Like it's there. They just don't celebrate it the way Americans do. Like how many guys in America really are the Arnold Schwarzenegger type, like how many people really are bellicose and warlike? How many people in America are men of action, shall we say, use a vague term. How many people really are this type? Well, that tiny minority in America is celebrated. The difference with Japan, it isn't the absence of that character type. It's the fact that they don't celebrate it in the movies, on TV, in the mainstream culture that way. And I think people who really live in Japan, really study Japan, they know about that. They know about that kind of tough, warlike side of Japanese culture that's still there. So what if you start having more direct democracy where that voice gets to be heard and where those people get to make decisions? Because currently, any of these parliamentary democracies, there's nothing democratic about the decision to start a war, and there's nothing democratic about the decision to end a war. To say we have indirect democracy is really an insult to direct democracy. What we have is un-democracy. So, I think that's the great question. And look, guys, so just to come back to the other example I used before, nobody supports the military dictatorship in Myanmar. But right, if we had direct democracy, I'm just being real with you. I don't know what percentage of Americans or what percentage of Japanese people would support a military intervention in Myanmar. Like that might be way less than 50%. That also wouldn't surprise me. Life isn't fair. A lot of people want to help want to help Ukraine fight Russia, and very few people want to help Myanmar fight its own military dictatorship. There are reasons. One is an internal civil war, and one is an international war with an aggressor, invading. There are all kinds of differences. It's not as simple as just saying racism, but racism might be a factor. And look, as I've mentioned this before, I count as Jewish. I'm not a member of the Jewish religion, but genetically I count as Jewish. If you think that doesn't matter, if you think it wouldn't shape my experience in Poland, in Ukraine, in Russia, it's huge. The extent to which there would be racism directed against me cannot be underestimated. These are intensely anti-Semitic parts of the world, which was crucial to my decision not to learn Russian. Obviously I could say to neither learn Ukrainian nor Russian. But if you're going to learn Ukrainian, you're going to learn enough. You're going to learn some level of Russian anyway. The two languages are so similar. That really was a choice for me academically in terms of career and everything else. And everything would be so different today if I had gone down that path. So so I've got we got more questions about anime. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. In anime, everyone is a pussy. And everyone who watches anime is a pussy. And, I'm sorry, but this is the part of my own, toxic masculinity. Yeah, you took the words out of my mouth. Part of my own toxic masculinity in attacking video game culture and anime culture is to say you guys are a bunch of fucking pussies. And you girls too. Sorry, women too. It's equal opportunity. Women who are into anime, women who are into video, it's the same shit. It's even worse, And all those people, when I say pussy, what do I mean? I mean you're locking yourself into a perpetual childhood. It's not just about masculine versus feminine. It's really about adulthood versus childhood. It's about a lifetime of making excuses versus taking on responsibilities and ambitions that don't really have to do with masculinity. They have to do with being a man, with being an adult. And women are welcome to get it, man. I mean, to say I'm equal opportunity is an understatement. I support women even more doing it. And we've talked about that for at least 5 years in the channel. But I can remember sitting down with Melissa and talking about that at length, where it's like, look, all of these things for women, they're even harder. And like the level of disrespect women get from their own parents, and like, like when women want to step up, what they have to deal with. Yeah. So no, yeah. Shout out to Larry. Thanks, Larry. I can take the comment. So look, I got just one question here from the audience. I'm seeing your comments come in. There's just one question here. I think I should answer. Sean Stone's comments, quote, "What is your prediction for the future of this war, Eisel?" I was wondering if someone would ask that. My prediction for the future of the war is 100% based on my analysis of Joe Biden. Why? Because at this time, I do not think any other anti-Russian leader is showing any initiative. So why am I emphasizing this at the start? I may be wrong for this reason. Okay, there are some wild cards. There are some people other than Joe Biden who could do something decisive. I'll give you two really exciting examples. China can flip the script on Russia. China can turn around and say they oppose imperialism, whether it's Russian imperialism or anyone else's imperialism. China can stab Russia in the back, and there'd be massive advantages for China. That would think about the next 100 years. Think about what a win it would be for China to turn around and say, you fuck around and find out. You signed this agreement with us 5 days before the Beijing Olympics, and now you pull this shit on Ukraine, and that's our opportunity to go after you. What does China want? China wants Mongolia, and they can take it. And they can take it away from Russia forever if they flip the script and stab Russia in the back. Now, that's great power politics, baby. I wasn't born yesterday. I know how this shit works, and we've been through this before. This wouldn't be the first time. Look up history of the Iron Triangle policy. China has flipped the script on Russia repeatedly, actually, on a small scale, but on a huge scale, they did it once, and it defined the whole Cold War period. It's a massive issue, the Sino-Soviet split. That was not a Cold War. That was a hot war, right? Red hot bullets flew. China can take the initiative. And in doing so, they would take the initiative away from Joe Biden, which is exactly what they want to do. And that's why this is a possibility worth talking about. China could also take Sakhalin Island that used to be part of China. I'm not kidding. That whole area, they could take away a big chunk of Siberia. But yes, China wants Mongolia. China would like to have more power in Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc. They don't need it. They don't. But if China wants to dominate Central Asia and Mongolia is really separate from Central Asia, they can do this now. And China is the weaker partner in the current dyad, the current, it's a three-way partnership right now. China, Russia, and Iran. It's bizarre, but that's the current anti-American alliance. It's a literal military alliance. They do military exercises together. Well, China has everything to gain by backstabbing Russia here, including just territory. So yeah, they could take the initiative away from Biden. Xi Jinping would be the one man to make that decision. Or unless senior members, and this is also possible. See, I wasn't born yesterday. Senior members of the Communist Party who want to get rid of Xi Jinping, this is their opportunity to do that and take over. Where they could say, hey, the Communist Party of China is opposed to great power imperialism, no matter who it is, whether it's America or Russia. That's always been their position. That's why China won't conquer Nepal. That's why China, there are all kinds of things China could do. They're not going to. That's why China doesn't invade Myanmar. Whenever those things happen, when there's an option that China says, no, we oppose imperialism, period, even when it would be to their advantage. So you could have a circle of senior officials in China who are tired of waiting for Xi Jinping to retire, who say, this is our chance. They get rid of Xi Jinping. They wrap themselves in the anti-imperialist flag, which every man, woman, and child in China has been born. They've been raised, from the bottle, from the milk bottle, from the cradle to the grave. They have been raised to believe that China is anti-imperialist. And then you'll have a huge advantage, huge reversal of situation, including you will completely revive the Chinese economy by reconnecting it at least with Western Europe, probably with America too. Probably economically, America will embrace you again if you turn the tables on Putin. So that's possible. So this is not my prediction. I'm saying it's possible. It's possible either because Xi Jinping himself does it, or as I say, there are people at the top of the Chinese Communist Party who want to get rid of Xi Jinping for a variety of reasons, but just including their own promotion. They want to be the next leaders. Well, this is their chance. And once this chance is gone, what's going to happen in the next 10 years? Xi Jinping has said he's never going to retire. Never is a long time. So yeah, that's possible. And then the other one worth mentioning is Turkey. So I don't want to get into huge details here. I'm pro Cyprus. I'm pro Greece. I'm politically, I'm anti-Turkey. But similarly, if Turkey were to actually march troops, if they were to actually send a large contingent of the Turkish army to go and fight Russia in Ukraine, that would be a huge political victory for Turkey. Suddenly, Turkey is the darling of the European Union. Suddenly, Turkey is the hero of the Americans and the British and the French and the Ukrainians, obviously. There would be so much for them to gain, including even short-term economically, right? And Russia is not going to nuke Turkey. And by the way, we're not talking about Turkey invading Russia. Then, sure, Russia would nuke Turkey. You're just talking about Turkey sending peacekeeping troops to Ukrainian territory, to be within Ukraine. That would be a big turning point. And guess what? Now you've taken the initiative away from Joe Biden. That's what it would do. It would massively make Turkey more powerful. And you'd be saying to the French and the Germans, guess who's in charge? So there's so much for Turkey to gain. And it's obvious their elected dictator, but the leader of Turkey, he's thought about it. And he's talked to Putin about it because he and Putin used to be close friends, and they're not anymore. So Turkey can flip this. So with those two significant Machiavellian footnotes, my prediction for the rest of the war is based on the analysis of Joe Biden and the assumption that Joe Biden is, from here on out, the only anti-Russian leader who's making any decisions. So yeah, we have India being mentioned. I've talked a lot about India in earlier videos. I'm just being honest. That's why I didn't talk about India in this video. There were a lot of hours talking about politics of India and its political connection to the United States, India and China. So I'm sorry. I'm just apologizing, guys. I'm not going to get into India because this video will go on forever. But you could point that out in terms of my assumption that Joe Biden alone is going to take the initiative. Well, that means France is not taking the initiative. Germany is not taking the initiative. It's pathetic, but this is obvious. England is not taking the initiative. But sure, you could also say India. This shows that India is not going to take the initiative. And so far, that's completely an indication. India is going to stand back and do nothing and try to basically passively profit from a kind of neutrality that embraces both sides. That's so far what India has been doing. And it is quite possible the vast majority of people in India do not care. That's hard to establish. But how much does this matter to India? By contrast, Myanmar matters much more to India. This is just part of life on Earth. But it's so I'm not for this video. I'm not seriously including India in the analysis. But I have a footnote that we made other videos talking about that at great length. So given that Joe Biden has all the initiative and is making all the decisions, in my opinion, Joe Biden's strategy is now completely clear. Footnote, what if I'm wrong? What if everything Joe Biden is saying publicly is an intentional deception and he's actually going to do the exact opposite? That's possible. I'll mention that again later. But based on what Joe Biden overtly communicates, his words and his actions, Joe Biden's strategy is to allow Russia to destroy its economic and political position in the world, which the Russians have done. It's for Joe Biden to sit back and say, Russia is making itself into a pariah. Russia is making itself into the new North Korea, and it is in our interest. Again, this is not my opinion. This is Joe Biden's opinion. I may disagree with Joe Biden on many levels, but Joe Biden's opinion is that it is in America's interest to sit back and allow Russia to render itself a laughing stock, subject of scorn and hatred and obloquy, to render itself the next North Korea. And maybe this will bring about or hasten the end of the Putin regime. But if not, Joe Biden's perspective is that it's good for America and it's good for Western Europe if for the next 10 years, for the next 20 years, look, if Putin continues to rule for 10 or 20 years, that Russia will, in this sense, be a burnt match. They will have spent all of the political capital they had, and they will be reduced to a poverty-stricken pariah state that no longer, so here's the point, Russia will never again be in a position to do what they did in Syria. And if anyone experienced the humiliation of the American policy being trumped by the Russian policy in Syria, it was Joe Biden, because that happened on his watch with Barack Obama. So Russia will never again be in the position to be kingmaker in Syria, to control politics, whether that's in Central Asia, the Middle East, around the Western world. That, you know, in a sense, you can even interpret this cynically as the sort of ultimate passive-aggressive revenge for the humiliation that America endured in Syria, and that specifically Barack Obama endured in Syria, and that specifically Joe Biden endured in Syria. You can read this psychologically as Joe Biden getting even for what went down in Syria. And to some extent, of course, it has to do with Iran. I know the average American doesn't give a fuck about Iran. Everybody who was educated at West Point and everybody who works in the bureaucratic elite in Washington, D.C. and came out of fucking, where do they come? They come out of fucking Princeton, New Jersey, this shit. All those guys are obsessed with Iran. Their world fucking revolves around, oh yeah, fuck. That's a great example of the difference between elite American culture and the hoi polloi. The masses don't give a fuck about Iran, but those people are obsessed with it. All those guys, whether they come out of Princeton or out of the actual, you know, military establishment. So yes, what Russia did with Syria, what Russia did with Iran, and both of those have been still ongoing right up to and including 2022. There's a sense in which that's a kind of revenge. So yeah, that's Joe Biden's strategy. So unless someone else takes the initiative, that's what's going to happen next. And the tragedy is, it's therefore in Joe Biden's interest to let the status quo in Ukraine just continue kindling, to just let this burn. And that's my prediction for what's going to happen. And it doesn't really matter if you pour $300 million on the fire or $10 billion on the fire. 10 billion is the headline grabbing statistic that's being bandied about these days. Joe Biden's attitude and his strategy is, the roof is on fire, let the motherfucker burn. And doesn't really matter if from Joe Biden's perspective, not my perspective, doesn't matter if 90% of the population of Ukraine flees as refugees or 50% or what. Because from that cynical Machiavellian perspective, letting Ukraine burn is the most efficient way to destroy Russia and destroy the regime of Vladimir Putin. It's more efficient than fighting a war. It's more efficient than CIA covert ops. It's more efficient than nuclear missiles. All you need to do is sit back and let it happen. And from that incredibly cynical perspective, nobody could care less about the extent to which the city of Kiev is going to become a rubble-filled parking lot.